Hello and welcome to another Paro seminar. This is a little bit of a supplement to the one that I just gave recently called Dialectic and Symptomatic, two approaches to political action. And in this supplemental seminar, I just want to talk a little bit about the notion of cultural Marxism in light of what I looked at previously. So I'll just do a small summary of what I did before, and then we'll throw ourselves into this notion of cultural Marxism. So first of all, basically, I argued that there are two approaches to political theory and political action. And everything that we see can basically be put into one of these two buckets when it comes to the desire to see political transformation. The first, I argued, can be called dialectic, and the second, symptomatic. And the argument is not that one can be divorced from the other. Actually, both of them feed on each other and can support each other, but they're not symmetrical. One has to be the foundation for the other. And I was arguing that the dialectic approach has to be the foundation for the symptomatic approach. Otherwise, you end up with a type of political acting out that is either impotent to make changes or even is a type of social utility that supports the very system that it attempts to consciously undermine. So the argument was the dialectic approach is the foundation for political transformation, and the symptomatic approach can then be nestled within that. And when that happens, you get basically a possible political action which always involves risk, because things that we do can cause problems as well as cause something good. So there's always a risk to political action. But when these are in the right type of relationship, we are more likely to be able to do something positive. And the dialectic approach, it comes out of Hegel, and Marx is the primary kind of dialectic thinker who kind of influenced the 20th century, who takes takes Hegel's dialectical method and applies it to political economy. And by the way, when I use the term Marxist, I mean it in a very kind of philosophical sense, in a very stripped down sense. So whenever I talk about Marxism, I am primarily talking about a method of seeking out a central contradiction within a particular mode of production, which is a particular way of creating and distributing goods, right? And in the last seminar, I looked at those different modes of production, but that we look at what the contradictions are that arise within a particular mode of production, and we end up with a type of singular contradiction that I was calling, using the kind of psychoanalytic term, the symptom. And when you bring that to the surface and when you address it, that can lead to a qualitative transformation in history, to a new mode of production. So what Marx is doing is he's interested in how the theorist looks at contradiction as it arises historically within society, and particularly Marx is interested in the contradiction that is occurring within the contemporary world, within capitalism. And so that's what I mean when I talk about Marxism, more than talking about actually existing communist or socialist governments or societies. So Marx takes this dialectic approach, and I looked at that in last seminar. But what it means is that we are not at the end of history. There are other stages of development that we can go through. So anyway, that's the dialectic approach. You're looking for a fundamental symptom, a fundamental knot or deadlock within a given economic system. You bring it to the surface. You show what alienating and destructive things come out of that knot, and then out of that tension can arise a different type of way of being in the world, a different way of organizing the world. And this is not progressivism, something I've covered in other seminars. This is not progressivism in the sense that you're progressing to a type of utopia where kind of antagonism can be gotten rid of. There's a little bit of that in Marx's writing, but that's kind of not very Hegel. It's also not progressivism in the sense of in progressivism you have like a type of omega point. You kind of know where you're going and you aim towards it. This is more of an apocalyptic approach. Apocalypse meaning the end of one world and the start of another. And no mind can conceive and no eye has seen what this new world can look like. We can kind of make guesses about it, but we don't really know what it's going to be like. All we can do is help end one world and have faith that the next world will kind of like integrate some of the issues of the previous one. So there's this ongoing approach to try to find the central antagonism, and that's what dialectics is. The symptomatic approach to politics concentrates more on the explosions of violence and oppression which happen within a given system. So it's not so much aimed at the system, but aimed at the system's inability to live up to its ideals. So the ideals are not the problem, it's the systemic injustice that is preventing us from achieving those ideals. And so I use the term symptomatic to talk about that. And in the last seminar, I looked at how these two can be seen to work together, or when they do work together, that's where the energy is for real transformation. Okay, so the dialectic, the symptomatic. Now the reason why this is a supplement to that seminar is because I want to then assess this idea of cultural Marxism, and I want to look at it in terms of whether it is cultural Marxism or whether it could be better described as cultural capitalism. So there's lots of stuff out there on YouTube talking about cultural Marxism, offering critiques, but I'll just kind of give a brief overview of what the term means, and then as I say, I'll try to isolate where I think the problem is in terms of the theoretical expression of cultural Marxism, and then I want to go a little bit further and say that far from being cultural Marxism, we might want to baptize this as a type of cultural capitalism, and I'll try and give an argument for why. Okay, so first person to look at is probably Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson is probably the most famous advocate of this notion of cultural Marxism. So you see it being used within conservative circles, and it's quite a persuasive thing when you hear it. It actually has the appearance of kind of of being sensible, and it kind of connects with some historical events. And I actually think it's quite an interesting theory. And so for Peterson, I'll outline Peterson's view, and then I want to outline another conservative thinker, Voddie Baucham, who gives a slightly different alternative that I think is slightly more accurate. So Jordan Peterson basically argues that with Stalinism and with the kind of failure of that experiment in Russia, he argues that the intellectuals in the West could no longer justifiably either endorse or be apologists for the communist experiment in Russia, or even be a type of communist or socialist, right? It became so impossible to advocate openly that position that you had basically one of two choices. If you were a French intellectual, you would either give it up and go into something else, and existentialism, whatever, but kind of give up the commitment to a socialist or a communist ideal. Or you could keep doing it, but shift from the economic into the cultural realm. And so Peterson argues that some of the leading intellectuals in the European tradition kept with their Marxist ideals, but started to apply those ideals to the cultural realm, looking at everything from entertainment industry, the news, looking at the educational system, the judicial system, looking at the role of basically the robes, the teachers, the politicians, the priests, their role in how oppression operates within those systems and within those structures. And so then Peterson says, so they're doing this, and the main advocates are a group of thinkers around the very famous Frankfurt School. They're kind of Marxist theorists who are applying Marxism in this cultural field. They basically create the discipline of critical theory. And then critical theory eventually finds its way into the American universities and gives rise to identity politics, what was called the politics of difference, but identity politics, woke ideology, etc. And that this ultimately is a threat to the central pillars of Western democracy. Right? So it kind of, this woke ideology kind of can effectively undermine the kind of the ideals of the Enlightenment. All right. Oh, and one thing that I should have mentioned, because this is where I think the key issue is basically the critical theorists kind of became the postmodernists. So you have this kind of move from economic Marxist, classical or orthodox Marxism, through to the critical theorists, through to the postmodernists or post-structuralists, the philosophical term for it, into then identity politics, politics of difference, and the kind of growth of these departments that concentrate on particularities like gender studies over universalities. Right. Now, this guy, Vodi Bochum, he has a slightly different reading, which is a little bit more accurate, I think. So it's very similar to what Peterson says. The one difference is Bochum says that it's not that the Marxists were putting the theory into different fields, right? Applying the notion of economic oppression to oppressions that occur within, say, the educational system. It's actually that it's more Christian than that in a way, right? So in the same way that the early Christians thought that Jesus would return in their lifetime, and then as Jesus wasn't making an appearance, began to theorize why not, right? So the early Christians were not building a movement, right? They were mostly thinking that the end of the world was coming, and in their lifetime. And then as people started to die off, and they were going like, okay, this doesn't seem likely. Like there's even these verses about, you'll see the kingdom return, before all of you have died, right? There's this notion of like, before the last of this generation goes, the Messiah will return. So that causes a bit of a crisis. And then you start to go, okay, right, we're not just like an apocalyptic cult waiting for the UFO to take us. We're going to have to maybe live the rest of our lives like this, and we have to figure out, why did the Messiah not come? So it's similar within kind of Marxism, is that Marx was theorizing that a revolution would occur, possibly within his lifetime or the generation that he was part of, that capitalism's antagonism was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. And of course, he lived at a time of a lot of dehumanization in relation to the workplace, industrialization, where people were being reduced to, in a very overt way, kind of mechanisms, given subsistence, living wages in order to serve a system. So he was seeing that this was increasingly kind of coming to a head, and he was theorizing that the revolution would come. Dies in 1888. Then there's some revolutions, some changes, but it doesn't happen. And so in the 20th century, various Marxist intellectuals are left with the question, why not? Why did the revolution not come? And this is what people like Gramsci and the Frankfurt School were addressing. Because what they basically began to look at and argue for is the idea that there is an incredibly pervasive ideological structure that mitigates against revolutionary change. And this is in Marx. Marx talks about this, but it's under-theorized. Marx primarily, especially in his kind of later work, is primarily interested with wages, with the relation between landowners, capitalists and labourers. And he's very much doing an economic analysis. So there was this area in which the role of schools, the judicial system, religion, kind of created an ideological structure that justified the system that made it seem eternal, like this is just the way it is, right? The current economic system is either endorsed by God or by nature. It is also eternal, it's part of our very nature, it isn't some sort of artificial or social thing, and also works for the benefit of everybody, right? And also then says, and some of you can get out of the difficulties you're in, you know, you can, there's always a little bit of social mobility, some people can escape it, so there's that promise of a type of heaven if you do the right thing, if you work hard enough, etc., etc. So they began to look at how the various structures, ideological structures within society prevent or delay the coming of a fundamental transformation in the way that we produce and distribute goods, create and distribute goods. And I think that's a bit more accurate, actually. I don't think that nowhere the Frankfurt School simply going, okay, let's just kind of look at oppression within kind of the educational system. I think it was more about how do these systems prevent economic change. Okay, so that's Bochum's view. But still the same way with Peterson, this kind of becomes postmodernism. You've got people like Derrida, Foucault who's finding power relations everywhere, right? That basically Foucault is looking at how very extreme forms of oppression, like for example in a society of slavery, the oppression doesn't go away, but oppressions become more deeply embedded, become more invisible, and they also disconnect from individuals. So you eventually get to systems where you can't point to any individual person to blame, right? You kind of, the oppression is within the structure itself, right? So Foucault's writing is very much exploring this power and resistance to power. Okay, so the first thing I want to say is just, I want to question that little element. I'm not going to spend too much time in this because I'm more interested in going, is the kind of ideology that people like Bochum and Peterson see as cultural Marxism, is it really actually more of an apologist for the capitalist system? So that's what I want to get to. But I think the main error in this description of cultural Marxism is the very subtle move that's made between Marxism and critical theory by the Frankfurt School and postmodernism. Right, so whenever you're looking at magic tricks, the way you work out a magic trick is there's always, you think there's 3 steps, A, B, C, but there's not. There's 5 steps. There's A, and then there's A1, B, B1, C, right? There's these steps that you can't see with your naked eye, but they're there, so you have to work out what are the steps that you can't see, because your brain, you know, breaks things often down to 3s, and it misses the other steps. So that's if you want to be a magician or a pickpocket or whatever, you kind of understand that. So where is the kind of like slight misstep? Very briefly, I would say it's by equating postmodernism with Marxism. I can see why someone would think that from the outside, and this is why I think this is persuasive to anybody who hasn't studied continental philosophy, because the continental philosophers are all engaging with Marx. Right? No matter whether you're a Marxist or not, you're reading Marx, you're engaging with Marx, because Marx is one of the central figures. Just like Hegel is one of the central figures, you can't really do continental philosophy without engaging with the work of Hegel in some way, even if it's critical. You can't kind of ignore it. So in postmodernism, yeah, there's people like Derrida wrote the book Spectres of Marx. The people like Foucault are very well versed and very well trained in Marxist theory. So everybody's talking about the same kind of stuff, and so it's very easy to think that they're all maybe broadly in agreement. But when you get deeper in, you see that there's actually quite a strong argument between the post-structuralists and the Marxists, and they're not really intertwined, right? One of the interesting things is how they interact, and that's one of the conversations, but they're not easily, one doesn't morph into the other. And the best way to understand that is one of the most famous one-line descriptions of post-structuralism or postmodernism is from Lyotard, who says postmodernism is incredulity toward meta-narratives, right? which means that the postmodern thinkers in various fields were generally very suspicious of any grand story about how society evolves and moves, right? That is a critique of a lot of things, a critique of Hegel, but it's also a critique of Marx, because Marxism is a meta-narrative. It is a story that really talks about the development of history through various stages, and tries to scientifically kind of like work out what has happened and where things are going. So in a way, the postmodern thinkers, even if they were interested in Marxist themes and spectres of Marx, this substantive Marxism was rejected. And what you end up having, so Marxism basically can be described as a form of structuralism. And structuralism finds underlying structures within language, within society, within our psychic structure that kind of dictate who we are. So although we have an infinite variety of ways to speak, for example, there's an underlying grammar. And although a good example actually is movies, there's an infinite number of movies that are possible to make. And if you go onto Netflix, you can go through and see all these different types of movies. But actually, underlying this kind of infinite variety of movies are structures. And we know these as genres, action, comedy, horror. And then sometimes these genres are mixed. But what you do is you kind of start to break it down, and you see that, and this is if you want to be a screenwriter, you have to begin to work out, oh, there's structures involved, right? It's not just this, I sit down and I write a story. It's right, no, you've got to understand the various structures. And once you start to understand that, it becomes very easy to, write a movie. And, the more inane or the more generic a movie is, the closer it is to a structure. So if I'm bored, will want to watch some terrible straight to DVD action film, right? And the funny thing is they're all the same. If you actually read the descriptions on Netflix, you click to one, it's like former FBI agent, his daughter is killed and seeks revenge. Then you go to the next one, SAS, retired guy, family are murdered, he wants vengeance. The next one, it's a former police officer who's trying to lead a casual life. His past catches up with him, and his best friend is murdered, and he seeks justice. Right? You see there's an underlying structure. So that's a basic way to think of structuralism: is beneath the infinite variety of the imaginary, what the names of the people are, what they say, what they do. There's underlying structures, and then post-structuralism kind of builds on structuralism, but emphasizes a type of openness within structures that mean they never fully close down. They're always open to future possibilities. And so post-structuralism is showing how structures themselves are always open to renegotiation, rethinking, reinterpretation. And the truth is, structuralism and post-structuralism are very intertwined. And it's, very few people fit completely in one or the other. However, Marxism is more about structuralism, and postmodernism is more about post-structuralism, which means that a lot of postmodern thinkers or people who have been influenced by postmodernism start to become very sensitive to power dynamics within supposedly objective or universal claims. So you have postmodern thinkers who start to uncover self-interest and within reasoned discourses, and you start to kind of like, if you're a very Foucaultian, you start to look at power dynamics that are in arguments themselves, and this at an extreme gets you to these positions that basically you can't argue rationally with somebody because rationality is not your two worlds are incommensurable. There's nothing really you share in common. So ultimately you can what's called out-narrate the other, which means you can be like a sophist, you can be more persuasive than the other, you can paint a better picture of the world than the other, you can paint a picture of the world that more people would like to be part of, but ultimately you can't talk objectively and rationally about the world. It is always influenced by your positioning within the world, your moods, etc. Now, there's an interesting element of truth to that, but at its extreme, that's a kind of argument you can kind of come to. What C.S. Lewis called bulverism. There's a very funny article C.S. Lewis once wrote called Bulverism, where he sees this kind of relativism occurring, and he sees it as so pervasive in society, but he can't nail it down to one particular thinker, because there's no thinker who's a full-on relativist. So he makes one up, and he's called Ezekiel Bulver. And Ezekiel Bulver one day sees his mum and dad argue, and his dad says to his mum, "Oh, you're just saying that because you're a woman." And then Bulver, the young Ezekiel Bulver, light goes out and says, "Oh yes, everybody just says something because of their positioning, because of their gender, their upbringing, their race, etc., etc. And so you cannot think kind of in some sort of rational, metaphysical way in Bulverism." So check that essay out if you're interested. Okay, so the move from Marxism to postmodernism, there's a disconnect there. I would say actually, and there's a term called conservative postmodernism going around. I forget the guy who, Matthew somebody, he's connected to Zero Books. He's doing a PhD in the subject. I think he might have come up with the term postmodern conservatism, or he's making it popular, and kind of argues that what we see in the universities today is a type of kind of popular postmodernism in which people are on the right, you call it identitarianism, and on the left you call it identity politics, but where different groups are isolated from each other, advocating for their own oppression or the oppression of other people over others, and there's no kind of universal discourse to connect the two. Right. However, right, my issue and what I want to look at is whether this notion of cultural Marxism then should more be renamed as cultural capitalism. And by that, what I mean is that unintentionally does this politics of difference solidify the system unintentionally. So I'm going to make 3 points that I think make that argument, and then I'll kind of wrap it up. So the first point is that this politics of difference is about representation over redistribution. So you'll see in a lot of this kind of contemporary ideology the desire to see representation within various areas, so within CEOs, within the creative industry, within the educational industry. So the idea is not that the system is somehow inherently alienating, but rather that the system is alienating to some groups over others. And so if we're able to get representation in the system, things will run better. And so this basically says that the ideals of meritocracy, for example, are fine. It's just some people are being held back. And this is actually, if you've seen Genet's The Balcony, there's a movie made of it. I'm going to do a talk on it actually soon. But Genet did a play called The Balcony. He's a French playwright. And it kind of is all about a revolution that is happening in an unnamed city. And all of the action takes place in this brothel that is in the city but not of it. And ultimately, it's about how these revolutions are toppling one master to put another master in place. And so revolutions have a type of social utility to kind of shake things up and get the young people into power, get the old people out. Nothing wrong with that, but ultimately it kind of keeps the system going. So one of the issues here is that the notion that the system itself is not inherently alienating, right? That you can be within this system and it kind of like fully kind of realize yourself. So in Marx's early writings, in his economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844, he talks about this is the humanist Marx, who they call it so-called humanist Marx before Capital. But Marx writes very beautifully about alienation within the current system. And one of the ways to think about alienation is Marx argues that animals, he calls it animal being, right? Most animals are what they do, right? They don't make a distinction between who they are and what they do, and they don't live in that kind of relationship between who they are and what they do. A dog does dog stuff, a cat does cat stuff. Animals are what they do. Human beings, for Marx, he calls this species being. Human beings are a little bit different, and there's obviously going to be other species beings. So he's not just talking about humans, but humans are species beings. And one of the things he means by that is that human beings don't just do, they reflect on what they do. There is a disconnect between who they are and what they do. And so we are constantly a question to ourselves. We are constantly, in a very basic way, whenever I get up in the morning or not get up, that's a decision about the type of person I am or want to be. I'm always creating stuff. I'm always doing labour. I'm maybe seeing certain people over others. I'm deciding to read a book or watch a TV show. I'm deciding to go for a walk or go visit my mum. These are decisions that are being made all the time. And I'm putting myself into the world in different ways. And I can reflect on that. I make decisions about that. And ultimately what I'm doing, what I'm doing is I'm creating myself. As I'm going and doing these things over time, I'm not just expressing who I am, I'm kind of forming who I am. So who I am is expressed in my work, in my labour, in what I'm doing day to day, the decisions I make. And I come to know myself in what I do. So I come to create myself in my decisions, and I come to know myself in my decisions. Maybe an example would be if you're young and you cook a meal for friends, and you don't just cook because you have to. I can't cook to save my life. I've done terrible things when I was a student to kind of survive, but I'm not. But if you enjoy cooking, right, you cook something, and say your friends really like it, you cook for your friends and they're like, this is amazing, this is really good, and you feel complimented. Because it's not just that you made some food like I did in a utilitarian way to survive. You put yourself into what you made and you got compliments. People complimented. Actually, they didn't compliment you. In a way, they complimented the food. Oh, this food tastes amazing. But the compliment is to you because you have objectified yourself in the meal. And then what happens is maybe you go, okay, I would like to do that again for someone else. And maybe you then start to think about, I would like to be a chef, maybe have a little restaurant. And what's happening in this in a very basic way is you are not discovering yourself so much, but you are creating yourself, and the other people around you are creating you. And you are then discovering yourself through these activities, and you're seeing your skills, and this is a fulfilling life, right? For Marx, most of us don't experience this at all in the workplace. So in the workplace, we are creative, right? We're creating things. But often, especially if you think of a factory where you're creating a little part of a widget, like an iPhone or something, where all you're doing is doing one thing repeatedly, thousands of times every day. And you don't even know how it connects with the wider phone. And maybe you can't even afford the product that you're making. He's basically saying your species being, your creative, what he calls spiritual dimension, is reduced to animality, right? You're being pushed back to being like Pavlov's dog, just doing some activity. And then ironically, your animal activities become your human activities. So your human activities, which is your creative activities, are reduced to kind of animalistic, having to just do something that you don't enjoy, that you don't find yourself within, that you can't articulate your creativity in. And then secondly, the things that are actually for human beings are merely animal, like excreting waste, sleep, sex, right? These various things, eating, that we do that are enjoyable, but they're ultimately just, they shouldn't be where the kind of the highest dimension of our being is. They become that. So for example, you want a toilet break during work, right? That's the most enjoyable part of work, is going to the bathroom and being able to hide for half an hour. going to the cafeteria to eat your sandwich, so all of these activities that you can eat, you can have sex, these are good things, but they become kind of like the only way in which you can express your humanity. And the areas that you would be kind of developing your humanity become reduced to animality. And in the last seminar, I used a thought experiment of going, you have to ask yourself, if I won the lottery, would I leave my work? And if the answer is yes, then that's part of an experience subjectively of alienation, that you're doing your work not because you love it, but you're doing your work for compensation. And even if the compensation is good, you're ultimately then not expressing this creative dimension of your being in your work. And the other example is, if you find it hard to get out of bed in the morning and the alarm is painful to you, that also can be evidence of the subjective experience of alienation, because it's not the bed or the alarm clock that's oppressive, it's what you're going to. So somebody said, well, everyone finds it hard to get out of bed in the morning. Well, not if you're going to see someone you really like, or going to do something really fun, or kind of do something you enjoy. Then actually getting out of bed is easy, and the alarm clock is not oppressive. So in my own life, actually, it's interesting, because I'm lucky that I have pursued what I find creative satisfaction in. And for most of my adult life, I've been kind of poor, but in a very satisfied way. I was on unemployment benefit for a long time, lived in an estate, etc. But I pursued what was creative to me. And then in latter years where I had more money, that's great. The money's fantastic, and it means I can live in a better place. I can live without financial stress. But it's the money just is, it's not the compensation for the work that I dislike. It's an added bonus to doing the work that I like. Most of us, sadly, don't experience that. And that is, can we imagine a world where our creativity and our creative development is actually encouraged rather than kind of minimized and put down? So basically, Marx looks at the alienation of what we produce and the way that we produce it. So we're alienated from what we produce. We don't care what we're doing, what we're making, and also the way we have to produce it is also kind of destructive. So if a system and an ideology is simply looking at representation but not looking at redistribution, i.e. a fundamentally different way in which we can express our creativity, produce products, distribute them, then I would say that it is in the service of the present system, right? It's a kind of a type of weird apologist for the system. Secondly, anything that reduces contradiction to opposition also solidifies the current system. What I mean by that is the central contradiction of alienation. If it is reduced to opposition, i.e., the reason why things aren't working is because of that group of people, or this problem, if we got rid of that, then everything would be good. Then this basically means that it's a way of domesticating the alienation, of coping with it, of surviving with it. So it's called the scapegoat mechanism, where you find something that you can blame, that you can put all of the anxiety on and say, that's the issue. And that actually allows the system to continue to function, because it's not the system that's the problem, it's some opposition within the system. So this is a utopic vision within the structure, not a type of vision for something post the structure, which I think is impossible. I think every time you try to fantasize or imagine a utopic vision, you always idealize the structure you're in. So if you think of fairy tales, for example, in a fairy tale, within a certain society, it might be a poor person becoming wealthy, a single person getting married, an ignorant person finding wisdom. The fantasy is the fulfilling of the dream within the given system. So the idea of somebody becoming rich is like somebody winning the lottery. That's your way out of alienation. Or being single, finding a relationship, that's your way of finding some sort of fulfillment. Whereas in other societies, it can be a rich person renouncing wealth and becoming poor, or a person who is within a family or relationship leaving that, right? So your fairy tales are a type of idealized reflection of the present values. That's why progressivism, I think, always falls into a type of justification of the present system, because whatever you're able to positively imagine will be a type of utopia within the system. And that's why the apocalyptic vision is different, because the apocalyptic vision says we don't know what the future will look like. What we have to do is look at the contradiction within the present system, bring it to the surface, begin to address it, and a new world will come into being, but it's not necessarily one that we can imagine in advance. An example I like to use on that is the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland, where the various parties in 1998 came together to try to end the 30-year conflict called the Troubles. And everybody had to lay down their vision of what they thought Northern Ireland would look like. And whether it's part of the UK or part of Ireland, all of that, everything had to be laid down, and they entered into an apocalyptic space in which they were very aware of the contradiction and the violence, the eruptions of violence in the system, and they together argued and discussed and eventually came up with a document called the Good Friday Agreement that provided a way forward and provided one of the most successful, if not the most successful, peace processes in the modern world. So the idea then, is that you've got, instead of some opposition, some group that you can get rid of and then you can get to the ideal, the alternative is to try to really bring to the surface, to render visible the central antagonism and how it affects us all across the whole of humanity, even though some people benefit and some people don't, that somehow this is destructive to all of us. And as we can see that, we can potentially begin to create systems that can lead to a better way of engaging with each other and our world. So, for example, cooperatives. And I talked about cooperatives in the last seminar. I also talked about pyrotheology as creating spaces in which we're freed from the pursuit of some ideal that allows us to free ourselves from some sort of, basically the combustion engine that keeps all of things going, where we're frenetically trying to get the thing that will fix everything and then creating scapegoats when we fail to get there. So that's the second one. Is it looking at opposition, or is it bringing to the surface contradiction? And the third is, does the political view represent the end of history, or see itself as allowing the possibility of the ongoing march of history? What I mean by that is, Fukuyama uses this term, the end of history, which he takes from Hegel. But the way Fukuyama uses it is the end of history is, in a sense, the end of these massive transformations in economic and political systems. The end of history is basically, we've kind of got to the right system, and we can eternally tweak it and fix it and try to get rid of bad actors and bad apples and try to make all of these small changes, but we've got to the end of history. So again, it's this notion of, then we just have to critique within the system rather than critique the system. And the alternative to that are political acts which actually see us as part of the ongoing march of history, and don't see this as the end, but rather see that the things continue to move forward. I do think that there is a way of understanding the end of history, which is that we can eventually get a system in which the contradiction and the antagonisms that are at the heart of reality are integrated into reality. So what does that look like? In politics, it's called democracy, right? The contradictions of multiple actors are brought together within a structure that attempts to mobilize all of those disagreements for the betterment of society. So democracy is one of the earliest names we have for a type of end of history, in quotes, within the political realm. Within the biological realm, we've got the term evolution, which is evolution is within biology the way of mobilizing the contradiction within an organic structure for development and increasing complexity within an organic system. Within mathematics, you think of Gödel's incompleteness theorem, where within mathematics we've discovered that there is an inherent incompleteness to the mathematical structure itself, and that this is not the destruction of mathematics, but actually is a great progress in our understanding of mathematics. In quantum mechanics, we think of superpositioning, wave-particle duality. There's various names. In psychoanalysis, it's called the unconscious, which is the kind of contradiction within the subject that can cause all sorts of problems, but when you integrate it well, provides a real way of developing the self and feeling a way of being more creative. So in all of these, there's a movement to making the contradiction work. And I do think that we can think of a political system in which, an economic system in which that happens. But we'll leave that, for another seminar. So all of that to say that although people like Peterson talk about this notion of cultural Marxism, which is the kind of the bringing of conflict between oppressed and oppressor into the educational systems, into judging the judicial systems, religious systems, etc. Marxism isn't about simply oppressor and oppressee. Marxism is about a particular type of oppression within economic systems. And secondly, that's more in line with postmodernism and Foucault than it is with the Frankfurt School. And then secondly, the argument I was making is that these kind of political acts that arise out of what's called cultural Marxism could actually be better described as cultural capitalism, because they actually affirm the very system they seem to be attacking by advocating for the ideals of that system and saying, if only we get rid of the few bad apples, if only we can kind of get rid of some of the problems within the system, then it will run more smoothly. Okay, hope that was an interesting enough supplement. If you want to see the original seminar, it's on my YouTube channel and it's called The Dialectic and the Symptomatic. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.